Hello, and welcome to Beyond Biotech, the weekly podcast from Labiotech. I'm Dylan Kassane, and this is episode 160 for the podcast. Nearly 1 billion people around the world suffer from mental health disorders, with the global economic cost of these disorders expected to reach $6 trillion by 2030. One of the most common of these mental health disorders is depressive disorder, commonly called depression, with some 280 million people suffering from either mild, moderate, or severe depression each year. Conventional treatments for depression, such as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs, can work for many people, but for some suffering from treatment-resistant depression, options can be limited. But some new therapies are in the clinic and might offer some hope. Beckley PsyTech is a UK biotech that's working with next-generation psychedelic-based compounds administered in a short clinic visit once every 2 months. With positive returns from their recent Phase IIb study and a partnership with Atai Life Sciences, Beckley believes they are on their way to redefining how depression is treated. I spoke with Beckley PsyTech CEO Cosmo Feilding this week to understand more about how their therapy works, what makes it different to existing SSRIs, and how it stacks up against competitors in the growing psychedelic market. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Cosmo Feilding, welcome to Beyond Biotech.
Thanks, Dylan. Lovely to be here.
Cosmo, why don't you start by just telling me a little bit about yourself before we get to the company and to the work that you're doing. How did you find yourself right here, CEO of Beckley PsyTech?
Well, how long have we got? But look, I really developing psychedelics and conducting research into psychedelics and how they work in the brain and how they can help patients with mental health conditions is a kind of intergenerational family mission in my family. So I was kind of brought up with this being the main subject. My co-founder for Beckley PsyTech is actually my mother, who sadly recently passed away. But she ran a non-profit for 25 years, conducting research on how psychedelics work in the brain, and was really a major driver and is recognized as one of the major kind of forces behind this kind of renaissance in scientific research into how psychedelics can be used to help patients. So I kind of grew up with that as the kind of main topic of conversation at home, and have really kind of jumped in. And so that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years or so together.
Tell me a little bit then about Beckley PsyTech, your mission, your history. Where do you fit in this landscape of mental health, especially when we're talking about mental health in general, which means we've got something like a disease burden of 1 billion people? Where do you fit into that?
So, as you said, so I think the starting point, as you've just brought up, is that there is an absolutely huge and growing mental health condition around the world. There are so many people suffering from it, and the current treatments that are available have, very significant limitations for a lot of people. So for a lot of people, so the standard medication is SSRIs, for instance, and you take them as a daily medication, and it normally takes 6 to 8 weeks for you to feel whether they're working or not, and there are side effects which often people discontinue. So, and on top of that, there's been very little innovation in this field for a long time. So it's a growing problem with the current standard of care has significant limitations, and where Beckley PsyTech comes in is looking at whether we can help develop the kind of next generation of antidepressant treatments and kind of mental health condition treatments. And our focus is on psychedelics particularly, and convenient, scalable psychedelics. So that's the mission. And we're kind of now in the process of our lead candidate is just read out a Phase IIb, which I'll tell you about, and with very good data.
So what actually sets you apart then? Is there nobody else working in psychedelics, or are you doing something particularly different there when it comes to these traditional treatments for mental health issues?
So look, the crucial thing that we did at Beckley PsyTech is think about how you can take this new class of mental health treatment, the psychedelics, and actually make them scalable and accessible. And so the key difference that we've focused on is a short time in clinic. So a patient only needs to spend a couple of hours in the clinic for the treatment. And that is very different to most of the other psychedelics that are currently in development. And so if we kind of maybe, again, take a step back on how psychedelics have been developed thus far, that there was a huge amount of interest in these compounds in the 60s and 50s and 60s. Then research paused for several decades because they became illegal drugs. And over the last 25 years, there's been this renaissance in research, which Beckley Foundation was heavily involved in. And the focus of that research has really been on what we call the first generation of psychedelics. So that's LSD, psilocybin, MDMA to some extent. And the way the treatments are delivered is you go to a specialist clinic and you have a room on your own and you are under supervision from professional kind of healthcare providers for the entire duration of a kind of psychedelic experience. The aim is to induce one of these profound, intense subjective experiences and be under supervision for the whole duration of that experience. And what we've seen over the last couple of decades is really compelling evidence that these drugs, when delivered in this kind of safe, responsible setting, are not only very effective, but also generally safe and well tolerated. So that's and it's a completely different paradigm of treatment to the main kind of current standard of care, where, as I said, you're taking a daily pill and kind of almost indefinitely. So if you have an antidepressant, you could be taking it for years and years and years. Here, what we're talking about is it's a new paradigm of what's called interventional psychiatry. So rather than a daily medication, you go to a specialist clinic and you are given an intervention on the day. And what's amazing is what we've seen is a single dose of psychedelics can induce this rapid antidepressant effect. So you can feel it within a day after dosing, and it's maintained, and it's, can maintain effects for months, it seems. So that was the really exciting kind of concept around psychedelics. The challenge, however, is requiring a patient to sit in a room under supervision with a healthcare professional for an entire day, as the first generation psychedelics required, is a very resource intensive and expensive way of treating patients. And when you think about, to your numbers, 1 billion people, even tens of millions of people that need this treatment, that's going to be a major limitation. So that's where we come back to, can we show with our next generation treatments the same kind of efficacy and tolerability that you're seeing with the first generation, but a 2-hour clinic visit rather than a whole day in the clinic? And if you can, that becomes a much, much more scalable and accessible treatment for patients.
Tell me a little bit more about this science then. You're talking about the first generation psychedelics, the psilocybin, the MDMA, but you're pioneering what you're calling next-gen psychedelic compounds. What makes them so different to what we've seen before?
Yeah, good question. I mean, look, what we did was we started from the premise, as we said, was that, we know what the first generation drugs can do, and we start from the premise that these are going to work. How do we improve what's kind of being developed by them and make a clinically meaningful benefit for patients and healthcare providers? And that was what we decided was, can we identify a drug that provides the same kind of intense and profound subjective experiences, but the duration of that experience is much, much shorter, more like an hour rather than 6-8 hours. And so that led us to explore the kind of lesser researched psychedelics. So we landed on a drug called 5-MeO-DMT, or mebufotenin. And so this is a known psychedelic, but it's much, much less researched and also much less used in the real world than the kind of first generations one, like LSD and psilocybin. And what we knew about it was it is very intense but very short acting. And so from there we said, how do we take that and turn it into a proper pharmaceutical product that's going to be genuinely accessible to patients? And so that's where we developed BPL-003, which is a benzoate salt of 5-MeO-DMT, and it's delivered intranasally. So with a kind of Aptar intranasal device. It's a single administration in the nose and under supervision in this clinic. And the peak effects are, a matter of minutes to peak effect, and then they last, say, normally, perceptual effects have resolved within an hour, let's say. And so that's the key kind of, so they work in terms of the receptor activation and those types of things in a similar way to the first generation drugs like psilocybin, but they just have a much shorter kind of pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic profile.
Tell me more about this intranasal delivery, because it certainly makes it a little bit easier for the patient. But what does it mean for their experience, and what does it mean for accessibility more generally to BPL-003?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to point out here is which I haven't yet mentioned, is Spravato. So Johnson & Johnson are in some way paving the way for this new paradigm of interventional psychiatric treatment. So they developed Spravato, which is S-ketamine. It's a kind of analog of ketamine. And it's also delivered intravenously. So the way that works is you go to the clinic, have an administration under supervision of Spravato, and over the first 4 weeks, you come in twice a week for an administration. So you visit the clinic and you spend, again, about 2 hours. You have to, the REMS requires at least 2 hours of supervision for the patient. So that was when we were starting Beckley PsyTech, that was just kind of getting approved by the FDA as the kind of for treatment resistant depression. And it was paving this regulatory pathway for a new type of treatment. And we also expected that they would also be then building out the infrastructure for these treatments to actually be provided to patients. And that's what we've seen now. So now Spravato is a blockbuster drug. It's doing well over $1 billion of revenue already with a still tiny patient population considering the addressable market, and due to become a kind of $3 to $5 billion drug. So that's set the precedent here, and now there are 5,000 clinics registered to deliver Spravato in the US, etc. So from the beginning, we thought, how can we make a drug that fits as seamlessly as possible into the Spravato model that's being developed? And that's where it's an intranasal delivery using an Aptar device. Well, we are developing BPL-003 is also an intranasal delivery using an Aptar device. So extremely similar for the patients and the clinics that are providing these drugs. Again, 2 hours in the clinic. So that kind of, we believe, supervision, we can do it within 2 hours and people can be ready to leave within 2 hours of being dosed. Again, fits that model. And then the difference, though, and we can talk about that a bit later, the difference is what we've shown in our phase 2 study is a single dose. So one visit and one dosing administration of BPL-003 is equivalent, showing equivalent efficacy to Spravato over 2 months. So one dose for BPL-003 over 2 months is the equivalent to 8 to 12 doses of Spravato over that same period. So a much less time intensive, far fewer visits to the clinic than Spravato BPL-003 can provide.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago your Phase IIb trial. I looked at those results, and I'm going to quote here: rapid, robust, durable antidepressant effects for treatment-resistant depression. I'm going to ask you to walk me through what that means, but maybe you could start by just talking about treatment-resistant depression. What can we know, or what should we know about this condition?
Yeah, great. So look, I mean, as you said, so treatment-resistant depression is as it sounds like, it is defined by people who have depression, but are not responding to a number of available treatments. So once you fail 2 treatments that are currently available, you fall into the category of treatment resistant. And those people, look, depression overall is a very, very debilitating condition and affects, about 50 million people in the US and EU. But then about a third to a half of those people end up being treatment resistant because the currently available treatments aren't working very well, essentially. And people who fall into that category have a further generally have a more reduced quality of life. 30% of those patients will attempt a suicide at least once in their lives. So it's and have a much higher cost to the kind of healthcare systems, etc. So they are the most in need patients out of patients with depression, and also by definition the hardest to treat. So that's why with a new drug like BPL-003 and indeed like Spravato, you often target the most at need patients first and show that it can work for them before you broaden out to a wider population. So it is important to state that, because when we talk about the data that we're showing with efficacy, which I'll come to in a second, you have to bear in mind that these are patients who have not responded to what's available on the market already. So they've tried and they've failed to respond to what's available. And what we showed very, very encouragingly was a single dose of BPL-003 was induced this kind of rapid antidepressant effect. So within the day after dosing, you saw a marked antidepressant effect. And then that was maintained all the way out to our blinded follow-up for 8 weeks. So one dose on day 0 was showing lasting antidepressant effects. The kind of mean antidepressant effect was maintained all the way out to 2 months afterwards. And so the efficacy was comparable to what Spravato has shown, as I said, but with a single dose rather than 8 to 12 doses in that same period. And again, it was similar to the first generation of drugs, of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin, but again, a single 2-hour visit in the clinic rather than a whole day in the clinic. So in both of those ways, we show kind of clear advantages for the patients and the healthcare providers. But, most importantly, for patients, if we can genuinely provide a treatment that, a large number of people see a rapid reduction that's then sustained for 2 months at least, that is a complete transformation for how these patients are getting treated at the moment.
What about safety as well? The trial showed that there were no suicide-related safety signals. There were 99% of adverse effect were pretty mild or perhaps moderate. How does this influence your path towards regulatory approval and towards adoption by patients as well?
Yeah, so that's the kind of almost more important than efficacy is safety, especially from a regulatory perspective. So with what we were, and the way we designed the study was we actually had, one of the challenges with psychedelics is the kind of control for blinding, because there's this very intense subjective experience. So we actually used an active placebo. So we were controlling the study with an active placebo, so a 0.3 milligram dose. And then we had a medium dose, which was an 8 milligram dose, and then a high dose, which was a 12 milligram dose. And what was really encouraging was that both the 8 and the 12 milligram dose showed good tolerability. So it was generally well tolerated. And as you said, so most of the adverse events were mild or moderate. During this blinded period, there were no drug-related serious adverse events. And there was no suicide-related safety signal. That was another thing that people, again, inherently in a treatment-resistant depression population, suicide is a risk. And there was some concern about previous studies in the psychedelics realm that there could be some relation to suicidality. We showed that there was none in this study, which was really encouraging. And that also aligns with the other studies we've done so far. So all of those are really encouraging. I'd say the other really great thing was that it turned out that the medium dose, the 8 milligram dose, had just as good efficacy as the 12 milligram dose, but actually even better tolerability. So for phase 3, what that means is we can confidently go in with a lower dose, which generally means there are going to be less side effects, but still be confident that we're going to see the efficacy that we need to see to have a real difference for patients. So that's a really nice place to be. And so we believe this study is very much sufficient to allow a swift and smooth progression into phase 3.
We're talking about treatment-resistant depression, but you've seen maybe there's scope to use BPL-3 for other areas of mental health, in particular, one here for alcohol use disorder. And you've got a Phase IIa study out about that. Can you report a little bit about how that's going and what you've been able to see so far?
Yeah, look, and I think more broadly, again, I think the way we look at this is there's been so much research done on psychedelics in a range of different indications, primarily in a kind of academic settings. But depression is the area where there's the most evidence so far, but then certainly in kind of anxiety disorders, PTSD, and also substance use disorders, I think are the three main categories where there's been a lot of research. And we believe BPL-003 could be applied to all of those indications. So we believe there's a broad range of conditions that BPL-003 could help with. We are targeting treatment-resistant depression as the start, and we think that makes sense as the one to kind of, it has the clearest regulatory path, clearest unmet need, and clearest kind of commercial model as well. But, we definitely want to explore other disease areas as well. And so what we did was a proof of concept study in alcohol use disorder, and a similar model as what I described in the Phase IIb for TRD. What we looked at was delivering a single administration of BPL-003 in combination with psychological support. And what we showed was that induced a rapid reduction. Again, immediately after dosing, we saw a massive reduction in heavy drinking days and a very significant increase in abstinent days. And so those are the two markers that with substance use disorder and alcohol use disorder that you use to the kind of gold standard to measure improvement. And again, with that single dose, those positive kind of therapeutic outcomes were maintained for 3 months of follow-up. So again, it's showing, I think, that BPL-003 is working at least as effectively as the first generation psychedelics in a range of conditions. We believe there are a whole range of substance use disorders that could be looked at here as well. And we, again, that's a huge unmet need for patients. And again, there is also a lot of overlap between mental health conditions. So there's a lot of overlap between anxiety and substance use disorder, or depression and substance use disorder. So you're also looking at how you can help with different comorbidities as well. So we will definitely continue to look at how we can explore being able to help patients with those additional conditions as we progress.
Let's talk business a little bit. The economic cost of mental health disorders, and you've mentioned a couple of ways that you might be addressing that already, but that's projected to reach something like $6 trillion globally by 2030. How do you actually plan to address this sort of unmet need, but in a scalable way, something that can be looked at on a regional level, a national level, a global level?
Look, I think this is where you, as you said, it is such a vast problem. And I think that the really encouraging thing is that there is so much more awareness and recognition of this problem than there was 15 years ago, let's say. and more resources are going towards it, because it makes people suffering from mental health conditions tend to be less high functioning, less able to hold a job, less able to hold a family, etc. So there's a huge social cost, whether you put a dollar amount to it or not, kind of thing. And what we want to provide really is a better way of treating these conditions. And I think in terms of scalability, Spravato is the first big step here. So this new paradigm of interventional psychiatry, where patients go to the clinic and have an intense treatment that is meant to have impacts faster and then less side effects as well, because again, what we saw with BPL-003 is the side effect profile is primarily on the day of dosing, rather than continuously everyday dosing like SSRIs at the moment. And so people go to the clinic, they have a single administration and hopefully feel better within a day or two. That's the aim. And so that helps them, get back to work sooner. It helps them, do all of those types of things, which is important from a reimbursement and health economics perspective. So what we're really trying to do is be the second movers. We don't want to be the first movers, because we are building out a completely new way of treating mental health conditions. Spravato is leading the way. I think oral psilocybin will be the next one. We want to come in after that with a much, much more efficient, scalable treatment. I think Spravato now, they're doing between 50 and 100. They have a kind of between 50 and 100,000 patients at the moment, which is it's a drop in the ocean for how many patients need to be treated. But importantly, they are showing, by even addressing that tiny percentage of the market, it's a very, very viable commercial model. They're on track to do $3+ billion of revenue a year. So there is a huge amount of room for multiple drugs to be addressing these kind of these patients. And I think the more clinics and infrastructure there is that has been built out with Spravato and then with oral psilocybin and MDMA, the better, because the easier it will be for the uptake and the scalability of these treatments across the board. And that will especially apply to BPL-003.
Let's talk about some of this competition. There are other companies out there who are working in psychedelic therapies, Compass Pathways, GH Research. They've got their own programs. How do you actually differentiate yourself in what is potentially going to become a very crowded field?
Yeah, look, I think we're very well differentiated, and I'll explain that why. But I think the other important thing to say here is that we want there to be multiple drugs that come to market in this class. We are creating a new class of mental health treatment. We believe we are one of the leaders in that space, but we don't want to be doing it on our own. We're creating a totally new paradigm. We're delighted that Johnson & Johnson are leading the charge with Spravato, and we want others to come through, because I think overall it's changing the whole way mental health is treated. But where we separate, and we're very confident about this, is when you look at our competitors. You picked out. Let's talk about three of them. Let's talk about the kind of Spravato, which we've mentioned already, Compass, which is oral psilocybin, and then GH, which is also working with 5-MeO-DMT. They're all looking at treatment-resistant depression as well, so that's why they're equally relevant. So, as I mentioned, with Spravato, the clear point of differentiation here is that it's the same time in clinic, 2 hours in clinic, but we only need one clinic visit over 2 months, and they need 8 to 12 clinic visits over 2 months. If that's the case, then if you think about the patient experience, they are having to go to the clinic, be driven to the clinic, be driven back from the clinic, spend 2 hours in the clinic. So that's half a day. And if you do that twice a week, that's a day of your life a week taken up for 2 months. Whereas what we're talking about is one of those visits. So let's say it's half a day for the 2 month period rather than, and so just in terms of the patient experience, think about how much difference that would make for you being able to get back to your normal way of life. And equally for the clinic, if you're able to treat far more patients because they only need one clinic visit in that period, 1 or 2 clinic visits rather than 8 or 12, again, you can help far more patients, and it's also more profitable. And so that's the clear differentiation with Spravato. Now let's move on to the kind of, let's say, the first generation psychedelic in TRD, which will be COMP360, which is oral psilocybin. So we've shown similar efficacy to Compass, to COMP360 with BPL-003. You can argue about, potentially shown slightly better durability and those types of things. But the real difference that we've always wanted to show is that we can get that level of efficacy, but with a 2-hour clinic visit rather than a 8-hour clinic visit. And if you think again from the patient, that the issue with oral psilocybin is it's absorbed in a very variable way for people. So for most people, it takes 30 minutes to an hour for the effects to start coming on. But for some people, it takes far longer than that. So some people are waiting around for an hour and a half or 2 hours before they have the effects. And so that's quite anxiety inducing in itself, because you're waiting for this kind of very intense experience to start and not knowing where it's going to start. For the clinician, they're sitting in the room for hours waiting for people, and then a whole day of looking after someone and kind of intense supervision. So it's just a kind of more exhausting experience for the healthcare provider and the patient. Whereas with BPL-003, it's a matter of minutes to get to peak experience. So it's 3 to 5 minutes, let's say, to get to peak intensity, maybe 10 minutes. And then the overall duration, as I said, the perceptual effects normally end within 60 minutes, and you can go home. We've shown people are ready to be discharged within 2 hours. So again, that is just so much more convenient for the clinic and so much more scalable as a treatment than a whole day in the clinic, right? So that's the clear differentiation then. Then we come to GH001. So that's a kind of a company working with 5-MeO-DMT as well, but they're looking at it in a different way. So they have an inhaled device. So it's a kind of, the original product that they've generated data on is this kind of medical cannabis vaporizer thing that heats up the 5-MeO-DMT and fills a balloon, and people then inhale the balloon, which is firstly, just prima facie, very unusual way of delivering a pharmaceutical drug. No device like that has ever been approved by regulators, whereas we are using an Aptar device that is very similar to Spravato. It's been approved by the FDA before. It's just much, much more familiar to healthcare providers. And a much clearer regulatory path. So that's the other key thing with GH. They've shown really compelling data, and it, again, just increases our confidence that we are working with a compound that has really, really positive therapeutic potential. The difference is they have this inhaled device, and they have a model where you have up to 3 doses in the administration. So you have 1 dose, and then if you don't have enough of what they call a peak experience, you're given a second higher dose. So you start with 6 milligrams, and if after the dose has happened and patients are kind of back in the room, you go, oh, did you have a peak experience? If the answer is no, then you have a 12 milligram dose and repeat that all over again, and then repeat that again and say, did you have a peak experience? No. Then you have an 18 milligram dose. So you can have up to 36 milligrams in a single setting, and each of those doses are 1 hour apart. So you're actually talking about the clinic has to provide for those 3 doses. So you're really needing to book out at least half a day in the clinic. So it's a longer time, and it's a much higher dosing than what we were showing, which was 8 milligrams being really effective compared to potentially 36 milligrams. But more fundamentally, really, we just believe we're well ahead in the race with those guys. So we expect to be first to market with 5-MeO-DMT because we conducted our Phase IIb. It was with an IND with the FDA. It was the biggest Phase IIb kind of phase 2 trial ever conducted on 5-MeO-DMT. It was 200 people-ish across 6 different countries with a very much following the FDA guidance, whereas GH001 has been on clinical hold with the FDA for over, I think, 2 years practically now. It's still on hold. And so they could only conduct a small phase 2 study in Europe so far. And we believe there's just a much less clear regulatory path to market for them, basically.
Let's talk about regulation then for a second, because traditionally there's been a lot of stigma around psychedelics. The regulatory burden has always existed there for pharmaceutical companies and biotechs. How are you navigating the regulatory burden that you've got to do to bring this drug to market?
So look, we're making great progress on the regulatory side of things. And I have to say, the regulatory path has been quite smooth for us so far, and we believe will continue to be so. So, you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the new administration in the US and them being very pro psychedelics, and is that going to kind of help with the regulations? And the FDA's, are they going to be more kind of, you know, favorable towards psychedelics? I think the first thing to say there is that our experiences of the FDA have been very supportive with psychedelic research already. So it's been going very well. They've really lent in. They've provided guidelines on psychedelic therapy. They've done workshops. They've given breakthrough designation to multiple psychedelic drugs. There was one big regulatory setback last year, which was MDMA being put on, not getting its NDA. And now we don't need to go into all the details there, but it cast some doubt over the kind of regulatory pathway for psychedelics. I think most people would argue that actually it was far more about the kind of idiosyncrasies of that data package than about psychedelics in general. So, you know, we've had a very good relationship with the FDA, and we believe, you know, our next step is to go to end of phase 2 and then move into phase 3, and we're preparing for that right now. But we have every confidence that they will continue to be supportive, and we believe breakthrough designation is something we could apply for, etc. So we're really kind of bullish about the regulatory pathway, is the truth. And you know, again, it's important to highlight that we are not reinventing the wheel here. Spravato was a scheduled drug for treatment-resistant depression delivered in a kind of interventional setting under supervision. That's exactly what we're trying to do. BPL-003, it's 5-MeO-DMT is a controlled drug. But again, there are multiple drugs that have been developed that were controlled and have been approved as approved pharmaceutical medicines. So, you know, Ritalin, ketamine, Epidiolex, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots and lots of drugs that have gone down that path already.
Let's look a little bit forward now. You're talking about a merger, or you've announced a merger with Atai Life Science to form Atai Beckley. You know, how does this help you to scale your clinical development? How does it help you get to market?
Yeah, look, we're really excited about merging with Atai and creating Atai Beckley, and we really do think that can kind of the combined company can be a leader in this field. And it kind of touches on what I was saying before, is we really think now is the right time to do this, because the next step is to move in. You know, we're moving from a phase 2 company to a phase 3 company. It requires a lot of additional capital and a lot of additional infrastructure and scale as a company. We are now going to be kind of, you know, an approval is within our sights and commercialization is within our sights. So it's a whole new chapter. And we feel like being a public company and joining forces and having a bigger pipeline and a bigger platform to raise money and be able to kind of build out the phase 3 infrastructure and capabilities that are required, it makes sense to do that together. And again, it's what I was saying is really this space is too big for one company to do on its own, and certainly too big for one small private company like us to do on our own. So, you know, what we want to see is a small handful of companies. We think there will be more consolidation in the space over the next, you know, little while. And we think there will be a few big winners here, and we think atai Beckley are really well poised with BPL-003 as the lead asset to be one of those kind of leaders in the space.
Let's look ahead then. If you were going to talk to me about what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, not just specifically to Beckley, but in terms of the mainstream acceptance of psychedelics into psychotherapy and into healthcare systems with payers, how do you see that progressing? What does it look like in the future?
So look, yeah, like I said, I think I think we genuinely are going to witness a transformation in healthcare, and I'm not one for hyperbole, but I do think over the next decade we will see a very, very different approach to treating mental health conditions. I think there'll be much, much more awareness of it, which is already happening. And then I think this interventional treatment model where you go for a treatment rather than just get given a daily medication, I think that's going to happen more and more. I think what we'll see is Spravato leading the way, and they're going to continue to grow. They've got now 5,000 clinics in the US registered. I'm sure that will increase and probably double over the next short period. Then we'll have oral psilocybin with COMP360. I believe that will come to market, and I believe MDMA will come to market as well, and maybe LSD for generalized anxiety, PTSD, treatment-resistant depression. Suddenly you have those kind of 3 new kind of first-generation treatments on the market, but again, working within a similar interventional psychiatry model. So where reimbursement and kind of scalability and the expertise for clinics, as well as the kind of the familiarity of clinicians and patients, is only going to increase with each of those treatments coming onto the market. And I think, and then you're going to have the second generation of drugs like ours, like BPL-003 coming to market soon after. So I think, within, let's say, 5 years or so, we will have a whole class of these treatments on the market, and a whole infrastructure of interventional psychiatry that's kind of really gone mainstream kind of thing. And so, I believe they will still be saved for the kind of more resistant patients for certain, because, the current standard of care, like SSRIs, they don't work for everyone, but they're generic, they're cheap, and they are safe for most people and work for a decent proportion of people. So, I believe this won't be first line treatment for a long time, but it will be increasingly common as second, third line treatment for patients. And I think you'll see that in, increasingly in depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, substance use disorders. You're going to see a real kind of expansion of the potential kind of applications of these treatments as well.
I guess if that's the market that we're looking at, what about for Beckley? What are the milestones that you're going to set for the company and for this new partnership in the next couple of years? What should we be looking for?
Look, we've got a pipeline that we're really excited about with kind of atai Beckley. So clearly BPL-003 is the lead compound, and that's the one that the most attention is going to be. So, in the next year or so, we've got, we intend to be, getting breakthrough designation, moving into phase 3, getting that moving in treatment-resistant depression. I think watch this space for, potential other applications for BPL-003 as well. So that's the kind of, the big move. And we aim to move into phase 3 as quickly as possible and get that study done as quickly as possible, especially, without cutting corners. I want to emphasize, we need to do it properly. But, with the current administration, there is a real chance that there are going to be ways to responsibly accelerate time to get to patients as well, which would be great. So that's the kind of the big milestone with BPL-003. But then there's, what is currently atai but will be atai Beckley has VLS-01, which is a DMT, and it's an oral dissolvable film of DMT. So that's another short time in clinic psychedelic that's currently in a phase 2 study in treatment-resistant depression again, but again, has potential applications in a whole range of areas. So next year we'll get a readout on that. I very much expect that to be effective and well tolerated as well. And then there's EMP-01, which is a different drug. That's a kind of analog of MDMA. So and looking at social anxiety disorder. So there's another phase 2 going on that. Then we have a drug discovery pipeline where we're also looking at kind of non-hallucinogenic neuroplastogens. So there's a whole pipeline of kind of novel treatments within this class that we're exploring. And I think that's what's so exciting. There's the real ability to kind of spread this net quite wide and really see how many people we can help with a single company kind of thing.
Let me ask you just one final question. If we've looked at the market and where that's going to head, what your plans are for Beckley, that's pretty clear. What about your vision for just the impact that this will have on patients? What's going to be the impact of these new treatments coming to market? How will individual patient lives, actually improve?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I think, one can get lost in the data kind of thing. So, we talk about a reduction on the MADRS scale, but like, what does that actually mean for people? And I think what we get as well are the kind of anecdotal, more human experiences as well. And it's right to focus on the data and the means and the averages, but it's important to also put a face to it sometimes as well. And we've had some, multiple patients feeding back from the kind of open label studies that their lives have genuinely been transformed by this treatment. They've suffered from depression often for over a decade, without having any treatment, and then having this intense experience that not only, the interesting thing about these experiences as well is there is this subjective side of the experience, and people talk about having emotional breakthroughs and real insights into their lives that then the idea is with psychological support and they're able to kind of really integrate those insights and use it for real behavioral change. And that's really the whole thing here. Is what we're seeing is there's the subjective psychological side, and then there's this physiological underpinning of this, creating this window of neuroplasticity where there's a real kind of opportunity for people to change their behaviors and and whether that's kind of negative rumination and depression or addiction, but it allows people to not just change their own behaviors but change their relationships with their families. So it's that if you think about the ripples of effects that has on the people's families who are suffering from these conditions as well, then you start really thinking about how much of an impact these treatments can make on society as a whole. And that's really why this has been not only my life mission but my mother's life mission. So it's we're 50, 60 years into this, and we continue to believe that there is just so much potential to help society with this class of compound.
Cosmo Feilding, thanks for joining us today on Beyond Biotech.
Thank you very, very much.
That's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out all the latest news and analysis at Labiotech.eu. I hope wherever you are in the world, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.